respect also the employer is sovereign over the persons and charms of his employees. The threat of discharge suffices to overcome all resistance in 9 cases out of 10, if not in 99 out of 100, in girls who, in any case, have no strong inducements to chastity. If the master is mean enough, and the official report mentions several such cases, his mill is also his harem, and the fact that not all manufacturers use their power does not in the least change the position of the girls. In the beginning of manufacturing industry, when most of the employers were upstarts without education or consideration for the hypocrisy of society, they let nothing interfere with the exercise of their vested rights. To form a correct judgment of the influence of factory work upon the health of the female sex, it is necessary first to consider the work of children, and then the nature of the work itself. From the beginning of manufacturing industry, children have been employed in mills, at first almost exclusively by reason of the smallness of the machines, which were later enlarged. Even children from the workhouses were employed in multitudes, being rented out for a number of years to the manufacturers as apprentices. They were lodged, fed, and clothed in common, and were, of course, completely the slaves of their masters, by whom they were treated with the utmost recklessness and barbarity. As early as 1796, the public objection to this revolting system found such vigorous expression through Dr. Percival and Sir Robert Peel, father of the Cabinet Minister, and himself a cotton manufacturer, that in 1802 Parliament passed an Apprentices' Bill, by which the most crying evils were removed. Gradually the increasing competition of free work people crowded out the whole apprentice system. Factories were built in cities, machinery was constructed on a larger scale, and workrooms were made more airy and wholesome. Gradually too, more work was found for adult and young persons. The number of children in the mills diminished somewhat, and the age at which they began to work rose a little. Few children under 8 or 9 years were now employed. Later, as we shall see, the power of the state intervened several times, to protect them from the money greed of the bourgeoisie. The great mortality among children of the working class, and especially among those of the factory operatives, is proof enough of the unwholesome conditions under which they passed their first year. These influences are at work, of course, among the children who survive, but not quite so powerfully as upon those who succumb. The result in the most favorable case is a tendency to disease, or some check in development, and consequent less than normal vigor of the constitution. A 9-year-old child of a factory operative that has grown up in want, privation, and changing conditions, in cold and damp, with insufficient clothing and unwholesome dwellings, is far from having the working force of a child brought up under healthier conditions. At 9 years of age it is sent into the mill, to work 6.5 hours, formerly 8, earlier still, 12 to 14, even 16 hours daily, until the 13th year, then 12 hours until the 18th year. The old enfeebling influences continue, while the work is added to them. It is not to be denied that a child of 9 years, even an operative's child, can hold out through 6.5 hours daily work, without anyone being able to trace visible bad results in its development directly to this cause, but in no case can its presence in the damp heavy air of the factory, often at once warm and wet, contribute to good health, and, in any case, it is unpardonable to sacrifice to the greed of an unfeeling bourgeoisie the time of children which should be devoted solely to their physical and mental development, withdraw them from school and the fresh air, in order to wear them out for the benefit of the manufacturers. The bourgeoisie says, if we do not employ the children in the mills, they only remain under conditions unfavorable to their development, and this is true, on the whole. But what does this mean, if it is not a confession, that the bourgeoisie first places the children of the working class under unfavorable conditions, and then exploits these bad conditions for its own benefit, appeals to that which is as much its own fault as the factory system, excuses the sin of today with the sin of yesterday? And if the Factory Act did, not in some measure fetter their hands, how this humane, this benevolent bourgeoisie, which has built its factories solely for the good of the working class, would take care of the interests of these workers? Let us hear how they acted before the factory inspector was at their heels. Their own admitted testimony shall convict them in the report of the Factories Inquiry Commission of 1833. The report of the Central Commission relates that the manufacturers began to employ children rarely of 5 years, often of 6, very often of 7, usually of 8 to 9 years, that the working day often lasted 14 to 16 hours, exclusive of meals and intervals, that the manufacturers permitted overlookers to flog and maltreat children, and often took an active part in so doing themselves. One case is related of a Scotch manufacturer, who rode after a 16-year-old runaway, forced him to return running after the employer as fast as the master's horse trotted, and beat him the whole way with a long whip. 151 In the large towns where the operatives resisted more vigorously, such things naturally happened less often. But even this long working day failed to satisfy the greed of the capitalists. Their aim was to make the capital invested in the building and machinery produce the highest return, by every available means, to make it work as actively as possible. Hence the manufacturers introduced the shameful system of night work. Some of them employed 2 sets of operatives, each numerous enough to fill the whole mill, and let one set work the 12 hours of the day, and the other 12 hours of the night. It is needless to picture the effect upon the frames of young children, and even upon the health of young persons and adults, produced by permanent loss of sleep at night, which cannot be made good by any amount of sleep during the day. Irritation of the whole nervous system, with general lassitude and enfeeblement of the entire frame, were the inevitable results, with the fostering of temptation to drunkenness, and unbridled sexual indulgence. One manufacturer testifies 152a, that during the 2 years in which night work was carried on in his factory, the number of illegitimate children born was doubled, and such general demoralization prevailed, that he was obliged to give up night work. Other manufacturers were yet more barbarous, requiring many hands to work 30 to 40 hours at a stretch, several times a week, letting them get a couple of hours sleep only, because the night shift was not complete, but calculated to replace a part of the operatives only. The reports of the Commission touching this barbarism surpass everything that is known to me in this line. Such infamies, as are here related, are nowhere else to be found, yet we shall see that the bourgeoisie constantly appeals to the testimony of the Commission as being in its own favor. The consequences of these cruelties became evident quickly enough. The Commissioners mention a crowd of cripples who appeared before them, who clearly owed their distortion to the long working hours. This distortion usually consists of a curving of the spinal column and legs, and is described as follows by Francis Sharp, MRCS, of Leeds 152b. I never saw the peculiar bending of the lower ends of the thigh bones, before I came to Leeds. At first I thought it was rachitis, but I was soon led to change my opinion in consequence of the mass of patients who presented themselves at the hospital, and the appearances of the disease at an age from the 14th to the 18th year in which children are usually not subject to rachitis, as well as by the circumstance that the malady had first appeared after children began to work in the mills. Thus far I have seen about 100 such cases, and can, most decidedly, express the opinion that they are the consequences of overwork. So far as I know they were all mill children, and themselves attributed the evil to this cause. The number of cases of curvature of the spine which have fallen under my observation, and which were evidently consequent upon too protracted standing, was not less than 300. Precisely similar is the testimony of Dr. A., for 18 years physician in the hospital in Leeds 153a. Malformations of the spine are very frequent among mill hands, some of them consequent upon mere overwork, others the effect of long work upon constitutions originally feeble, or weakened by bad food. Deformities seem even more frequent than these diseases. The knees were bent and weak, the ligaments very often relaxed and enfeebled, and the long bones of the legs bent. The thick ends of these long bones were especially apt to be bent and disproportionately developed, and these patients came from the factories in which long work hours were of frequent occurrence. Surgeons Beaumont and Sharp, of Bradford, bear the same testimony. The reports of Drinkwater, Power, and Dr. Loudon contain a multitude of examples of such distortions, and those of Tufnell and Sir David Barry, which are less directed to this point, give single examples. 153b. The Commissioners for Lancashire, Cowell, Tufnell, and Hawkins, have almost wholly neglected this aspect of the physiological results of the factory system, though this district rivals Yorkshire in the number of cripples. I have seldom traversed Manchester without meeting 3 or 4 of them, suffering from precisely the same distortions of the spinal columns and legs as that described, and I have often been able to observe them closely. I know one personally who corresponds exactly with the foregoing description of Dr. A, and who got into this condition in Mr. Douglas' factory in Pendleton, an establishment which enjoys an unenviable notoriety among the operatives by reason of the former long working periods continued night after night. It is evident, at a glance, whence the distortions of these cripples come. They all look exactly alike. The knees are